What's the longest period of time that you've stayed in a job? For me, it was 10 years, and that decade seemed like a really long time, kind of like an era, a chapter, big chapter of my life. Lots of changes in both my personal and professional life during that time. But you know, a lot of people stay in jobs a lot longer than that. In particular, I know a lot of government employees or people in the military stay in for 15, 20 years to make sure they can get their full retirement benefits or full pensions. And some people even stay in the job longer than that. Just recently, a colleague retired, and the organization sent out an email thanking him for his 34 years of service to the same company. That is just hard for me to even imagine. But what if I told you that there's a band that has been recording and touring together for 60 years? And what if I told you that there's a distillery that's been in continuous operation for 160 years? Yes, continuous, even during Prohibition. How is that possible? We're going to answer that question later. Because this week's episode of Bourbon and Beats is going to be about Chicago's debut album, Chicago Transit Authority, and Old Forester's 1897 Bottled in Bond Bourbon. One of the founding members of Chicago, Walter Parazaider, passed away this week, just a couple of days ago. He had been battling Alzheimer's for a while and had to stop touring with the band in 2017 and finally succumbed to the disease this week. And so it was a sad week for fans of Chicago. And I was already preparing my notes for this episode, what I wanted to say about this album and the band as a whole and their legacy. And a couple of days after I started collecting those notes is when I heard about his death. And so I'm struggling a little bit today with what direction I should take. This is, in full disclosure, this is probably take number 10 or 12 and I'm alternating between the original thought process, the facts and figures, dates, things like that I want to point out, and the other idea of just making it kind of a tribute to Walt and his contributions to the music world. And so I think I'm just going to go off script and make it kind of a hybrid of those two things. Walt was probably the member most responsible for getting Chicago together in the city of Chicago in 1967. His idea was to get all the best available musicians in the city together and form something new. That would ultimately become a rock and roll band with a horn section. So you've got the traditional rock and roll sound with elements of jazz and funk kind of thrown in to the mix. That would Does anybody really know what time it is? Does anybody really care about time? And so they were trailblazers and came up with something new and innovative. And they spent the next decade unbottling, to coin a phrase. I heard that term in a Stephen King novel talking about a painter that came to painting late in life, but I think the term applies to a lot of artistic people that don't have an outlet for their art and all of a sudden do have an outlet for it. Sometimes they just unbottle and everything just pours out. And so sometimes Chicago would put out 2 or 3 albums in the same year during the 70s. In fact, this one was on the charts for 3.5 years, so that probably means they released at least 3 and maybe 4 other albums while this one was still on the charts. Something that you wouldn't you wouldn't dream of happening with an artist today. If for no other reason, the record company would stop it so that they could get maximum bang for the buck. But they unbottled for about a decade, and that era came to an end with Terry Kath's death in 1978 in a gun accident. And one of the interesting things I shared on my social media this week is just the thought that the two of them could be having a conversation and kind of catching up on the many years since then. And so that's a comforting thought. If there is, if we do go on after this life, then I like to think that they've had a good reunion this week. Robert Lamb, one of the other founding members, has said that he doesn't like to think in terms of eras in describing Chicago, but for me personally, it's unavoidable. That first era was the Terry Kath era. And a talented guitar player, songwriter, and singer, had a very soulful voice. He admitted himself he was oftentimes trying to channel Ray Charles when he sang, and he was pretty successful at it. He sounded like a version of Ray, really, on a lot of tracks. But once that era ended, a new era began, which was the David Foster, Peter Cetera era. Peter was also one of the founding members, and probably the one you've most likely heard of. And he ushered in a new era of the band in a songwriting partnership with David Foster that would take them more into a top 40 ballad-driven direction that made them very successful as far as album sales, and it's kind of where I came in. And I remember my first exposure to Chicago was probably at the skating rink when it was time for couple skating. The DJs would always throw on a Chicago song. So that was how I got introduced to the band, and I didn't find out until later, as I started to discover their back catalog, that they were at one time such an innovative band before they became more of a top 40 type band. Not that there's anything wrong with top 40, by the way, but it was a huge departure from what Chicago started out as. The horns in particular were kind of pushed to the back burner, and so were some of the other musicians in the band. In fact, David Foster often used session musicians on recordings during that era rather than using band members to come into the studio and record. And if you've been watching this show at all, it probably won't surprise you when I tell you that several members of Toto were on Chicago albums in the 80s. When Peter Cetera left to pursue a solo career, that second era of the band kind of ended, and since then I call it the carrying on era. From around 1990 on till now, the band has been touring with a kind of a revolving cast of musicians filling in for the ones that are no longer with the band, and playing a lot of the hits and occasionally recording some new music. And they are still entertaining to see and still put on a great show. There are 3 original members still with the band, so there are definite ties going all the way back to the first album. But that first era of time is the part of the band that I like best, and this album kind of encapsulates that era very well, of course, since it's their debut album. There are some songs that you may have heard on this album. Does anyone really know what time it is? Beginnings, I'm a Man, which is kind of a really long jam session with multiple lead singers, and it's just a really interesting jam if you like jam music. If you're a fan of the Grateful Dead or Fish or bands like that. Well, Chicago was doing it way back in '67, so if you like that kind of music, definitely check that track out in particular on this album. And then one complete side of this album, it's a double album, so there's 4 sides. One complete side is Terry Kath experimenting with guitar. So there's some more radio-friendly stuff on this album, and there's also some highly experimental stuff on this album. So probably something for everyone if you like music. But I just really can't think of any more words to honor Walt's legacy, and other than to say thank you for what you did, your contributions to the music world, and thank you for this album in particular, which I just had on the turntable last night while enjoying a nice glass of bourbon. And rest in peace. I hope you enjoyed the music during the transition. I think I failed to mention that Walt's primary role within the band was that of a saxophone player, but as you just heard, he also could play some very beautiful flute solos. Old Forester was the very first distillery to bottle whiskey. It was founded in 1870 and was allowed to continue producing whiskey and bottling it during Prohibition. Now, the government allowed only 6 distilleries to have a special license in America to produce whiskey for medicinal reasons rather than for enjoyment during the Prohibition era. Now, that always makes me giggle when I think about that, because my late grandmother would always keep a bottle of Early Times in her house, which happens to be owned by Brown-Forman also, just like Old Forester is, so same company. She would keep a bottle of Early Times and used it primarily for cooking when she was making particular recipes. But when she would pull the bottle down off the shelf, she would always check it to make sure it was still okay by having a little sample. And she'd always go, "Woo, it's still good." Well, that's still good too. And it has a really nice balance in the mash bill: 72% corn, 18% rye, and 10% malted barley. So it's kind of in the middle as far as rye goes. Last week I talked about a very spicy rye in my collection that was in the 30s. And then typically a rye product is maybe 12 to 15. So this one's 18, which makes it a little spicier, but kind of in that mid-range. And so it's a really nice one. And it's become one of the regular bottles on my shelf, this particular one. This one is a bottled in bond product. You'll probably see over my shoulder there's more Old Forester products on my shelf, but this one's my favorite because it is bottled in bond. That puts it in that 100 proof category. And it also means that though this product doesn't have an official age statement on the bottle, it means that it had to be aged at least 4 years. And it also comes in at just $50 retail. So it's a readily available, affordable, quality bottle. And so it's become one of the daily drinkers on my shelf. You know, if you are a bourbon collector too, you probably have some bottles that you only bring down when you have special guests or when it's a holiday, or official bourbon day was just last week, I think. So maybe on a day like that, you pull one of those special bottles off the shelf. And then you also have bottles that are kind of your bottom shelf bottles that you only use for mixers when someone wants a whiskey and Coke or some kind of other mixed drink. You might use it for that. But then you got your bottles in the middle that are everyday drinkers, the ones you really like, but because they're so affordable and readily available, then you can have them every day. And this bottle, the Old Forester Bottle and Bond, is one of those bottles for me. In fact, it comes off the shelf at least once a week, and it's getting a little low, but don't worry, I've got another one in the closet to take its place when I finish this one off, which might be this afternoon. So, good bottle, one that I definitely recommend. And if you like it as well as I do, then let me know in the comments. And if you have a comparison that you think another bottle that's similar price range and availability maybe compares a little better, let me know that too. I'd love to have some good discussion about that. Well, thanks for watching this week. And again, apologies for being a little bit off script and a little bit off kilter, but you know, just thinking about Walt and trying to do the best to honor his legacy and the legacy of the band kind of threw me off a little bit. So I'm going to let video clips and do most of the talking on this episode. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, like and subscribe. Leave a comment, as I said, about the whiskey or about Chicago, your favorite Chicago memory. And we'll see you next week.